Marcus Wellington's hand froze mid-reach for his wallet, his 7-year-old daughter Emma tugging at his coat sleeve as they witnessed something that would shatter their world forever. Outside Milano's restaurant on Christmas Eve, a young woman knelt beside the dumpster, her trembling fingers clutching moldy bread crusts, while whispering, "I'm sorry, Mom. I know you taught me better than this." What stopped Marcus cold wasn't her homelessness. It was the leather journal pressed against her chest like a prayer book. Emma's gasp pierced the December air as the woman looked up, revealing eyes that held secrets deeper than desperation. A businessman stumbled backward, his phone clattering to the sidewalk. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, recognizing something in those familiar green eyes that made his blood run cold. Marcus remembered another Christmas Eve, another woman who'd disappeared from his life without explanation, his infant sister given away when he was too young to understand. The woman's whispered words echoed, "I'm still looking for you, Marcus." "Dad, help her!" Emma pleaded, her small voice cutting through his paralysis. Who was this stranger who knew his name, and why did her presence feel like destiny finally catching up with him? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The penthouse apartment on Fifth Avenue told the story of a man who had everything money could buy and nothing his heart truly needed. Marcus Wellington stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching snow dust the city below like powdered sugar on a wedding cake, a comparison that made his chest tighten with memories he'd buried beneath 18-hour workdays and board meetings. 2 years. It had been exactly 2 years since Sarah's funeral, since he'd stood in this same spot holding Emma's tiny hand while she asked why Mommy wouldn't wake up anymore. The accident had been swift, a drunk driver running a red light on Park Avenue, but the aftermath stretched like an endless winter. Marcus had thrown himself into building Wellington AI systems, transforming grief into algorithms and loneliness into profit margins worth $2.3 billion. Emma sat cross-legged on the Italian marble floor, her auburn curls falling across her face as she arranged a nativity scene with the careful precision of a child who'd learned early that broken things couldn't always be fixed. At 7, she possessed an unsettling wisdom about loss that made adults uncomfortable. She'd stopped asking for a new mommy after the third nanny quit, claiming the little girl was too intense and asked too many questions about heaven. "Daddy, why don't we have Christmas dinner with other people?" Emma's voice carried the weight of a question she'd been saving. "Mrs. Chen next door says Christmas is about family, but we're only 2 people." Marcus loosened his tie, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing in moments when his daughter's innocence exposed his failures. Mrs. Dorothy Chen, their 78-year-old neighbor, had become Emma's unofficial grandmother, the one who taught her to fold dumplings and told stories about old Shanghai while Marcus buried himself in quarterly reports. The truth was, Marcus had forgotten how to be around people who weren't impressed by his net worth or intimidated by his reputation. Sarah had been his translator to the world of genuine human connection. Without her, social gatherings felt like performance art, and he'd gradually retreated into the sterile comfort of wealth and isolation. His phone buzzed. Victoria Sterling, his business manager, sending the evening's financial reports. Even on Christmas Eve, the machine of success never stopped grinding. Victoria had been instrumental in building his empire, but lately her advice felt more like warnings. "Don't let emotion cloud business judgment, Marcus. Remember what happened to your father." His father, another ghost that haunted these marble halls. Robert Wellington had lost everything to a woman who'd claimed to love him, leaving behind only debt and broken promises. Victoria never let Marcus forget that cautionary tale. Emma looked up from her nativity scene, where she'd arranged the wise men to face away from the manger. "They look lost," she explained, "like they can't find what they're looking for." Marcus knelt beside his daughter, adjusting one of the figures. In the amber glow of the Christmas tree lights, Emma's green eyes, Sarah's eyes, reflected a loneliness that money couldn't cure. The December wind cut through Marcus's wool coat as he stepped onto the sidewalk, Emma's mittened hand warm in his. Milano's restaurant glowed like a beacon against the darkening sky, its windows fogged with the breath of Christmas Eve diners, sharing stories over wine and laughter. He'd reserved a table for two, a hollow gesture toward normalcy that fooled no one, least of all himself. "Daddy, look." Emma's voice carried that particular tone children use when they've spotted something adults would prefer to ignore. 20 feet from the restaurant's entrance, beside a dumpster that reeked of garlic and discarded dreams, knelt a young woman whose desperation had stripped away everything except raw dignity. Her blonde hair hung in tangles beneath a knit cap that had seen better winters, and her fingers, bare despite the December cold, carefully sorted through scraps of bread and wilted vegetables. Marcus felt his chest constrict. He'd written checks to homeless shelters, attended charity galas where homelessness was discussed in abstract terms over champagne and canapes, but witnessing it this close felt like having his comfortable worldview grabbed by the throat. The woman looked up as they approached, and Marcus found himself staring into eyes the color of summer grass, eyes that held intelligence, shame, and something else he couldn't identify. Fear, perhaps, or recognition. "I'm not stealing," she said quietly, her voice carrying the careful diction of someone who'd once commanded boardrooms or classrooms. "I was looking for ingredients that might still be good. My grandmother always said, 'Waste not, want not, child. Every scrap has potential.'" Emma stepped forward before Marcus could react, her 7-year-old heart unburdened by the social protocols that paralyzed adults. "Are you hungry? We have lots of food upstairs." "Daddy has a whole refrigerator that's mostly empty because he doesn't know how to cook anything except toast, and sometimes he burns that." The woman's laugh came out as a half-sob, and Marcus noticed how she clutched a worn leather journal against her chest like armor. The binding was cracked, pages yellowed with age and what looked like tear stains. "I don't think your daddy would want—" "Actually," Marcus heard himself saying, surprising them both, "my daughter's right. It's Christmas Eve and we—" He paused, unsure how to explain that their dinner reservation was really an expensive way to avoid sitting alone in their penthouse, counting the empty chairs around their dining table. "We have more than enough food." The woman studied his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, as if she were memorizing his features. "You're very kind, but I couldn't impose—" "Please," Emma interrupted, and something in her small voice broke Marcus's heart all over again. "Mommy used to say Christmas was about sharing with people who need family." The woman's breath caught, and she looked between father and daughter with an expression Marcus couldn't decipher. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of someone who'd been waiting a very long time to say them. "My name is Grace Mitchell," she said, extending a hand that trembled slightly. "And I've been looking for someone for a very long time." Marcus shook her hand, noting the calluses that spoke of hard labor and the faint scar across her palm. "Marcus Wellington, this is Emma." Something flickered across Grace's features when he said his name. Surprise, hope, and something deeper that made his skin prickle with unease. "Wellington," she repeated softly, as if testing the sound. "I had a friend once, but that was a long time ago." They walked to the penthouse in relative silence, Emma chattering about Christmas traditions while Grace listened with the focused attention of someone starved for normal conversation. In the elevator, Marcus caught Grace staring at their reflection in the polished steel doors. A millionaire, his motherless daughter, and a homeless woman whose story was written in the lines of exhaustion around her eyes. The penthouse door opened to reveal Marcus's carefully curated life. Minimalist furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Abstract art that meant nothing to him, and a kitchen that looked like a showroom because he'd never learned to make it feel like home. Grace stepped inside and went perfectly still, her gaze moving across the space with an expression Marcus couldn't read. Her fingers tightened around the leather journal, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "This is beautiful," she said, but there was something hollow in her tone, as if she were seeing ghosts in the marble and chrome. Emma tugged on Grace's coat. "Are you really going to cook for us? Mrs. Chen says cooking is like giving hugs to people's stomachs." Grace smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had seen from her, and knelt to Emma's level. "Your Mrs. Chen sounds very wise. And yes, sweetheart, I'm going to cook for you. It's been a long time since I had anyone to cook for." As Grace moved toward the kitchen, Marcus noticed she walked with the careful steps of someone who'd learned not to take shelter for granted. Grace moved through Marcus's pristine kitchen like a pianist returning to a familiar instrument after years of silence. Her hands, roughened by months of survival, traced the marble countertops with reverence before opening the sub-zero refrigerator to reveal shelves of organic produce that had never known the touch of genuine hunger. "You have beautiful ingredients here," she murmured, pulling out carrots still dusted with earth, fresh thyme that released its fragrance at her touch, and a whole chicken that would have fed her for a week on the streets. "Waste not, want not, that's what my grandmother used to say." Emma perched on a bar stool, chin resting in her palms as she watched Grace work with the fascination of a child witnessing magic. "Mrs. Chen says cooking is like painting, but with food instead of colors." Mrs. Chen sounds like a very wise woman. Grace's knife moved in precise strokes as she diced onions, tears streaming down her face that had nothing to do with the vegetables. "Cooking is also memory, sweetheart. Every recipe tells a story." Marcus leaned against the doorframe, mesmerized by the transformation occurring in his sterile kitchen. Grace had rolled up her sleeves, revealing arms marked by small scars and a faded tattoo on her wrist, numbers that looked like a date. As she worked, she hummed something low and melodic, a tune that made the empty spaces in the penthouse feel smaller, warmer. "What story does this recipe tell?" Emma asked, pointing to the golden broth beginning to simmer on the stove. Grace paused, her hand tightening around the worn leather journal she'd placed beside the cutting board. "This one tells the story of Sunday dinners when I was about your age. My grandmother would make this soup every Christmas Eve, and she'd say it was a recipe for bringing people together who belonged together." Something in her voice made Marcus step closer. "Your grandmother raised you?" "From the time I was 5. Grace's knife never stopped moving, but her voice grew distant. "My parents died in a car accident. Grandmother Rosa was all I had left, and she taught me that food was love made visible. She used to say that if you cooked with your whole heart, you could heal almost anything, except loneliness." Emma's eyes went wide. "My mommy died in a car accident too. Daddy says she's watching us from heaven, but sometimes I forget what her hugs felt like." The knife stilled in Grace's hand. She turned to look at Emma with an expression that held such tenderness it made Marcus's chest ache. "Oh, sweetheart. I bet she's watching you right now, and I bet she's proud of how brave and kind you are." "Do you think lonely people can find each other?" Emma asked with the devastating directness that children wielded like weapons against adult pretenses. Grace glanced at Marcus, and something passed between them. A recognition of shared wounds, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that they were both people who understood what it meant to have the bottom fall out of your world without warning. "I think," Grace said carefully, "that sometimes the universe has a way of putting people exactly where they need to be, even when it doesn't feel like it makes sense." As the soup simmered, filling the penthouse with aromas that transformed the space from a showcase into something that felt dangerously close to home, Grace opened her leather journal. The pages were yellowed with age and handling, filled with handwritten recipes in fading ink. But Marcus noticed there were also photographs tucked between the pages, old snapshots that she touched with fingers that trembled slightly. "This belonged to my grandmother," she explained, noticing his attention. "Everything I know about cooking, about loving people through food, came from these pages. I've carried it with me through everything." Emma leaned over to peek at the journal, and Grace showed her a photograph of a small woman with silver hair and laughing eyes, standing in a kitchen that looked nothing like Marcus's gleaming monument to unused wealth. "She looks nice," Emma said softly, "like someone who gives really good hugs." "The best hugs in the world," Grace agreed, her voice thick with emotion. She used to say that every meal was a chance to tell someone they mattered. As they sat down to eat, Marcus found himself studying Grace's face in the candlelight Emma had insisted on lighting. There was something familiar about the curve of her jaw, the way she tilted her head when she listened. When she smiled at something Emma said, laugh lines appeared around her eyes that spoke of a past when laughter came easily. The soup was extraordinary. Not just the flavors, which were complex and comforting, but the way it seemed to fill spaces in Marcus's chest that he hadn't realized were empty. Emma ate with enthusiasm he hadn't seen since before Sarah died, chattering about Christmas wishes and asking Grace questions about cooking with the relentless curiosity of a child who'd found a new favorite person. "This tastes like love," Emma announced, using a phrase Mrs. Chen had taught her. Grace's spoon paused halfway to her mouth, and Marcus saw her eyes fill with tears. She quickly blinked away. "That's the nicest compliment a cook can receive, sweetheart." Later, as Emma dozed against Grace's shoulder on the sofa, Marcus found himself reluctant to break the spell that had settled over his penthouse. For the first time in 2 years, the space felt occupied rather than simply inhabited. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For tonight, for her. She hasn't been this alive since her mother died." Grace looked down at Emma's sleeping face, her expression soft with something that looked dangerously like maternal love. "She's an extraordinary little girl, Marcus. You're raising someone truly special." The way she said his name made him look at her sharply. There was something in her tone, not romantic interest, but something deeper and more complicated that he couldn't quite identify. The morning after Christmas dawned gray and bitter, but inside the Wellington penthouse, warmth radiated from the kitchen where Grace had risen before dawn to prepare breakfast. Marcus found her standing at the stove, her hair caught in a shaft of winter light, humming the same melody from the night before as she flipped pancakes with the practiced ease of someone who had once fed armies of hungry diners. "You didn't have to," he began, but she turned with a smile that stopped his protest mid-sentence. "I wanted to," she said simply. "It's been so long since I had someone to cook for. Besides, I heard Emma asking Santa for pancakes shaped like snowmen." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Emma appeared in the doorway wearing pajamas decorated with reindeer, her auburn curls wild from sleep. Her face lit up when she saw Grace, and Marcus felt something twist in his chest at the pure joy in his daughter's expression. "You stayed!" Emma launched herself at Grace, who caught her in a hug that looked as natural as breathing. "Of course I stayed, sweetheart. I promised you snowman pancakes, didn't I?" Over breakfast, Emma peppered Grace with questions about her life, her travels, her grandmother's cooking. Grace answered with patience and warmth, but Marcus noticed how she deflected certain inquiries. Questions about where she'd been living, how long she'd been homeless, whether she had any family looking for her. "Grace," Emma said around a mouthful of syrup-soaked pancake, "do you have anywhere to go for New Year's?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Grace's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and Marcus saw something flicker across her face, hope warring with resignation. I have arrangements, she said carefully. What kind of arrangements? Marcus found himself asking, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Grace set down her fork and met his eyes with a directness that made him feel exposed. There's a shelter in Queens. Pastor Murphy holds beds for regulars like me during the holidays. It's not much, but it's warm and safe. Emma's face crumpled. But we have lots of bedrooms here. You could stay with us. Emma, Marcus said gently. But his daughter had inherited his stubborn streak and Sarah's passionate heart, a dangerous combination. You could teach me more cooking, and we could watch movies, and you could read me stories like Mommy used to. Emma's voice rose with each word, tears threatening. Please, don't go to the shelter. Please stay with us. Grace looked between father and daughter, her expression pained. Sweetheart, your daddy has his own life, his work. I can't just... Actually, Marcus heard himself say, surprising everyone, including himself. Emma has a point. We have the space, and it's the holidays. You shouldn't have to spend New Year's in a shelter. Grace's eyes widened. Marcus, I couldn't. You don't even know me. I know you made my daughter smile for the first time in months. I know you cooked the first real meal this kitchen has seen since Sarah died. I know you're kind and intelligent, and you're down on your luck through no fault of your own. He paused, studying her face. What I don't know is why you look at me sometimes like you're seeing a ghost. The color drained from Grace's cheeks, and she gripped the edge of the table with white knuckles. I don't know what you mean. But Marcus was a successful businessman because he could read people, could spot tells and vulnerabilities, and Grace Mitchell was hiding something that went deeper than simple homelessness. The way she said his name with such careful pronunciation, the way she studied his face when she thought he wasn't looking, the photographs tucked in her grandmother's journal that she guarded like state secrets. Stay, Emma pleaded, climbing into Grace's lap with the ruthless efficiency of a child who knew how to weaponize her own innocence. Please, I'll be good, I promise. I won't ask for anything else ever again. Grace's arms came around Emma automatically, and Marcus saw her resolve crumble. I suppose I could stay for a few days, just until I figure out my next step. The next few days turned into a week, then 2. Grace transformed their sterile penthouse into something that felt dangerously close to a home. She filled the space with cooking aromas and laughter, taught Emma to braid bread and fold dumplings with Mrs. Chen, who had taken to dropping by with increasing frequency to check on the child. Marcus found himself rearranging his schedule to spend time at home, something he hadn't done since Sarah's death. He worked from his home office, listening to Grace and Emma's voices drift down the hallway like a melody he'd forgotten he loved. Grace had a way of making even mundane activities feel meaningful. Grocery shopping became an adventure in discovering new flavors. Cooking became chemistry lessons disguised as play. But there were moments when Marcus caught Grace staring at him with an expression that made his skin crawl with unease. Once he found her in his study, looking at the family photographs on his desk with tears streaming down her face. When he asked what was wrong, she'd mumbled something about missing her grandmother and fled to the kitchen. Another evening he overheard her on the phone speaking in hushed tones to someone she called Father Murphy. I found him, she'd whispered. After all these years, I finally found him. But he doesn't remember me. How could he? He was so young when... She'd stopped abruptly when she noticed Marcus in the doorway, her face flushing with guilt. Found who? He'd asked, but she'd claimed it was about a cooking job she was hoping to get. The lies were small, inconsequential things that might have been simple privacy if not for the way they accumulated like pressure in a sealed container. Grace's past remained a carefully guarded mystery, despite the intimacy growing between them. Not romantic exactly, but something deeper and more complicated that Marcus couldn't name. It was Emma who finally forced the issue. 3 weeks after Christmas, she collapsed during a tea party with Grace and Mrs. Chen, her small body convulsing as foam bubbled from her mouth. Grace's scream brought Marcus running from his office, his heart stopping at the sight of his daughter rigid and shaking on the Persian rug. The ambulance ride to Mount Sinai felt like traveling through hell. Emma lay unconscious on the stretcher, her face pale as winter moonlight, while Grace held Marcus's hand with a grip that threatened to break bones. "She'll be okay," Grace whispered, but her voice shook with fear. "She has to be okay." Dr. Sarah Goldman, the head of pediatric medicine, met them in the emergency room with news that made Marcus's world tilt on its axis. Emma had suffered a seizure caused by a rare blood disorder that had been silently attacking her system for months. She needed immediate treatment, possibly surgery, and definitely a transfusion from a compatible donor. "Her blood type is extremely rare," Dr. Goldman explained, her voice gentle but firm. "AB negative with additional antigens that make matching difficult. We're checking the registry, but I have to be honest, finding a compatible donor could take time we don't have." Grace stepped forward before Marcus could process what was happening. "Test me." "Ma'am?" "The chances of compatibility." "Test me," Grace repeated, rolling up her sleeve with trembling hands. "Please." 2 hours later, Dr. Goldman returned with results that defied statistical probability. Grace wasn't just compatible with Emma. She was a perfect match, down to the rarest antigens, the kind of match typically seen only between close family members. Marcus stared at the test results with growing confusion and something that felt dangerously like recognition. "How is this possible?" Grace had gone very still, her face white as hospital sheets. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Sometimes the universe puts people exactly where they need to be." But Dr. Goldman was frowning at the blood work, her expression puzzled. "Mr. Wellington, I need to ask you something. Do you have any siblings? Any family members who might have given a child up for adoption?" The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Suddenly, Grace's mysterious phone calls made sense, her careful way of saying his name, the photographs she guarded so jealously, the way she looked at him sometimes like she was memorizing his face. "Grace," he said slowly, his voice hoarse with dawning understanding. "Grace, who are you really?" She looked up at him with tears streaming down her cheeks, her hands shaking as she reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph so old the edges had gone soft with handling. It showed a little boy with dark hair and green eyes standing next to a baby, with Marcus's nose and Sarah's stubborn chin. "My name is Grace Wellington," she whispered. "I'm your sister, Marcus. I've been looking for you for 25 years. The hospital room went dead silent except for the steady beep of Emma's heart monitor. Marcus felt his knees buckle, caught himself against the wall as the world rearranged itself around this impossible truth. His sister, the baby his parents had whispered about in hushed tones when they thought he was asleep. The child they'd given away when he was barely old enough to understand what adoption meant. The ghost who had haunted his childhood dreams and adult therapy sessions. "That's impossible," he breathed. But even as he said it, he was seeing the similarities he'd been blind to, the shape of her eyes, the way she tilted her head when she listened, the stubborn set of her jaw that mirrored his own. Grace reached out tentatively, as if afraid he might vanish. "You probably don't remember me. You were only 3 when I was placed with the Mitchells, but I never forgot you. I never stopped looking." The revelation hung between them like a live wire, crackling with 25 years of questions and the devastating weight of blood recognition. Marcus gripped the hospital room wall, his successful businessman's composure cracking like ice under pressure as he stared at the sister he'd mourned as a child. and forgotten as an adult. "Show me," he whispered, his voice raw with something between hope and terror. Grace's hands trembled as she opened her grandmother's leather journal, revealing not just recipes, but a carefully preserved archive of a life built around searching for someone who'd forgotten she existed. There were newspaper clippings about Wellington AI Systems' success, photos taken from across streets and through restaurant windows, a private investigator's reports dating back 15 years. "I've been watching you," she admitted, shame coloring her voice. "Not stalking, but keeping track, making sure you were safe, successful, happy. I hired investigators when I could afford them, followed your career in business magazines. I knew about Sarah, about Emma. I was at Sarah's funeral, standing in the back where you couldn't see me." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. All those times he'd felt watched, the strange sense of familiar eyes in crowded rooms, the inexplicable comfort he'd felt when Grace first entered his penthouse. It had been real. His sister had been orbiting his life like a ghost planet, invisible but always there. "Why didn't you approach me sooner?" His question came out harder than intended. Businessman's logic demanding answers that emotions couldn't provide. Grace flinched as if slapped. "What was I supposed to say? Hello, I'm the sister your parents gave away because they couldn't afford 2 children." "You were 3 when I left, Marcus. You didn't even cry when the social worker took me. You just watched." The memory surfaced unbidden. A little girl with pigtails being carried away by a stranger while he stood in the doorway, too young to understand permanence, too confused to protest. His parents had told him Grace was going to live with a nice family who could take better care of her, and then never spoke her name again. "I was 3 years old," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "I didn't understand what was happening." "I know." Grace's tears fell freely now, years of carefully contained grief spilling over. But try explaining that to a 5-year-old who spent every night for 2 years crying herself to sleep, wondering why her big brother didn't come find her. Dr. Goldman cleared her throat gently, reminding them they weren't alone with their family drama. "I don't mean to interrupt, but Emma needs that transfusion soon. The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning." Grace straightened immediately, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Of course." What do you need me to do?" "We'll start the blood draw now. Mr. Wellington, you should know that your sister's compatibility isn't just rare, it's medically significant. This level of match suggests Emma has the best possible chance for a full recovery." As Grace was led away for the procedure, Marcus sank into the chair beside Emma's bed. His daughter lay pale and still, connected to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical precision. She looked so small, so fragile, that it took all his strength not to gather her up and run from this sterile place where children fought battles they shouldn't have to fight. "Daddy?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through his spiral of despair like sunlight through storm clouds. "I'm here, sweetheart." He took her small hand, careful not to disturb the IV line. "Is Grace really my aunt?" Emma's green eyes, Sarah's eyes, focused on his face with unsettling clarity. "I heard the doctor talking to the nurses. They said she has the same blood as me." Marcus felt his throat close. How did you explain family betrayal to a 7-year-old? How did you admit that love sometimes wasn't enough to keep people together? "Yes," he said simply. "Grace is my sister. That makes her your aunt." Emma processed this with the serious consideration she brought to all important matters. "Is that why she felt like family right away? Mrs. Chen says blood calls to blood like magnets." "Maybe," Marcus agreed, though the scientific part of his mind rebelled at the mysticism. Still, there had been something inexplicably right about Grace's presence from the beginning. a sense of completion he'd attributed to loneliness, but now recognized as something deeper. "I'm glad," Emma said softly. "I always wanted an aunt, and she makes the best pancakes." 3 hours later, Grace returned pale but determined, a bandage on her arm and fire in her eyes. "The transfusion has started." "The doctors say Emma's responding well already." They sat together in the hospital room's artificial twilight, watching Emma sleep while machines monitored her vital signs. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 25 years of missed birthdays, untold stories, and the weight of a family torn apart by poverty and pride. "Tell me about your life," Marcus said finally. "The real version." Grace's laugh held no humor. "Which part do you want to hear? The part where the Mitchell family treated me like an unpaid servant until I aged out of foster care at 18? The part where I worked 3 jobs to put myself through culinary school? Or the part where I lost everything because I trusted the wrong person?" "All of it." So Grace told him about growing up with foster parents who'd taken her for the monthly checks, about sleeping in a basement that flooded every spring, about learning to cook from library books because Mrs. Mitchell considered the kitchen her private domain. She told him about working in restaurant kitchens from age 16, about the culinary scholarship that had been her ticket out of poverty, about the meteoric rise that had ended in spectacular public failure. "Jonathan Hayes was head chef at Luminescence," she continued, her voice growing tight with old pain. "I was sous chef, 27 years old, finally making real money. He was brilliant, charismatic, and married to the restaurant owner's daughter. I thought he was mentoring me." Marcus felt dread building in his stomach. "What happened?" "He was embezzling from the restaurant, skimming from vendor payments and staff paychecks. When the owners started asking questions, he planted evidence in my locker and blamed everything on me. Bank records, fake receipts, even testimony from vendors he'd bribed to say I'd been the one making deals with them." The betrayal was so complete, so calculated that Marcus felt sick. "Didn't you have legal recourse?" Grace's smile was bitter as winter wind. "With what money?" Jonathan's father-in-law owned half the restaurants in Manhattan. They had lawyers, connections, influence. I had a public defender who advised me to plead guilty to reduced charges. The case never even went to trial." "But surely someone believed you." "Who?" Grace's voice rose with old fury. "The staff who were afraid of losing their jobs, the vendors who'd been paid to lie, the foster parents who'd never wanted me anyway." She took a shuddering breath. "I lost everything, Marcus. My career, my apartment, my reputation. Jonathan made sure I was blacklisted from every decent restaurant in the city. Within 6 months, I was living in my car. Within a year, I was on the streets." Marcus stared at her, this woman who'd served him soup with such grace and dignity, who'd sung lullabies to his daughter and transformed his sterile penthouse into a home. The injustice of it burned in his chest like acid. "Why didn't you come to me then? I could have helped." "You think I didn't consider it?" Grace's eyes flashed. "You think I didn't stand outside your building a dozen times, working up the courage to call your office? But what was I going to say? 'Hello, I'm the sister you don't remember, and by the way, I'm accused of being a thief and I need money?' Your success story was all over the business magazines. You were the golden boy who'd built an empire from nothing. What did I have to offer you, except scandal and shame?" The words hung between them like an indictment of every choice they'd made, every missed opportunity for connection. Marcus thought about the nights he'd felt inexplicably lonely despite his wealth, the sense that something was missing from his carefully constructed life. His sister had been suffering blocks away, and he'd been too insulated by success to know. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words felt inadequate for 25 years of separation. "God, Grace, I'm so sorry." "For what?" Her voice was gentler now, tired rather than angry. For being 3 years old when our parents made an impossible choice? For building a successful life? For not magically knowing I existed? For all of it. For not remembering you better? For not looking harder when I got older? For having everything while you had nothing? Grace was quiet for a long moment, watching Emma sleep. When she spoke, her voice held a strength that hadn't been there before. You want to know the truth, Marcus? I'm not sorry it happened this way. If Jonathan hadn't destroyed my life, if I hadn't ended up homeless, I never would have been digging through that dumpster on Christmas Eve. Emma never would have invited me home. We never would have found each other. She reached over and took his hand, her fingers calloused from years of hard work, but warm with life. Maybe this was how it was always supposed to happen. Maybe everything that went wrong was leading us back to each other. Marcus squeezed her hand, feeling something shift inside him. Not forgiveness exactly, because there was nothing to forgive, but acceptance of the strange paths that had brought them to this moment. What happens now? He asked. Grace smiled, and for the first time since he'd found her beside that dumpster, it reached her eyes. Now we save Emma. Then we figure out how to be a family again. The surgery was scheduled for dawn, but sleep eluded Marcus as he paced the hospital corridors like a caged animal. Grace had insisted on staying beside Emma's bed, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of medical uncertainty that threatened to drown them all. Through the observation window, he watched his sister, the word still felt foreign on his tongue, stroking Emma's hair while whispering stories about their grandmother's kitchen. At 4 a.m, Victoria Sterling arrived like a harbinger of corporate doom, her Louboutin heels clicking against the linoleum with military precision. She found Marcus in the family waiting area, surrounded by empty coffee cups and the detritus of a sleepless night spent confronting truths that should have been impossible. "Marcus, what the hell is going on?" Victoria's voice carried the sharp edge of barely controlled panic. "The board is asking questions about your absence. Henderson Industries is threatening to pull out of the merger if you're not in the office by 9 a.m. You can't just disappear." "My daughter is dying," Marcus said quietly, not looking up from the medical forms he'd been pretending to read for the past hour. "And I'm sorry about that. Truly I am. But you have responsibilities that extend beyond your personal life. The company employs 1,200 people, Marcus. Their livelihoods depend on your leadership, not your emotional crises." The dismissive tone in Victoria's voice, the casual way she reduced Emma's life-threatening condition to an emotional crisis, ignited something volcanic in Marcus's chest. He stood slowly, every inch of his 6-foot frame radiating a fury that made Victoria take an involuntary step backward. "Get out," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Marcus, be reasonable. I said get out. Before I call security and have you removed from a children's hospital like the heartless vulture you are." Victoria's perfectly composed mask slipped, revealing something desperate beneath. "You don't understand the position you're putting me in. The board members are already questioning your judgment since that homeless woman moved in with you. If you miss this meeting, if Henderson walks away, they'll have grounds to remove you as CEO. Everything you've built will mean absolutely nothing if my daughter dies while I'm sitting in a conference room discussing quarterly projections." Marcus moved toward Victoria with predatory grace, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "My sister is donating blood to save Emma's life. My family, my real family, is fighting for something that actually matters. You can tell the board that if they want to remove me for choosing my child over their profit margins, they can go straight to hell." The word sister hung in the air like a confession, and Marcus saw Victoria's eyes widen with recognition and something that looked suspiciously like fear. "Sister?" Victoria's voice cracked on the word. "What sister? You don't have a sister." "Actually, I do. I have a sister who's been living on the streets for 18 months because someone destroyed her career with false accusations. I have a sister who spent 25 years looking for the family that gave her away. I have a sister who's braver and more loving than anyone in that boardroom will ever be." Victoria's face went white as marble, and she gripped the back of a plastic chair with white knuckles. "That's impossible. Your parents never mentioned—" "My parents made a lot of choices they were ashamed of," Marcus cut her off. "Maybe it's time I stopped repeating their mistakes." Before Victoria could respond, Dr. Goldman appeared in surgical scrubs, her expression professionally neutral in a way that made Marcus's heart stop. "Mr. Wellington, we're ready to take Emma to surgery. The blood transfusion has stabilized her condition significantly, and we're optimistic about the outcome." Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. Victoria tried to follow him toward Emma's room, but he stopped her with a look that could have frozen hellfire. "This is for family only," he said coldly. "And you're not family." Emma looked impossibly small on the gurney, dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding her, but her eyes were alert and focused as Marcus leaned down to kiss her forehead. "I love you, sweetheart," he whispered. "Grace and I will be right here when you wake up." Emma's gaze shifted to Grace, who had tears streaming down her face but managed a reassuring smile. "Will you tell me more stories about Grandma Rosa when I wake up?" "All the stories you want to hear," Grace promised, her voice steady despite her tears. "She would have loved you so much, Emma. You have her stubborn chin and her kind heart." As the surgical team prepared to wheel Emma away, she reached out her small hand to touch Grace's face. "Thank you for finding us, Aunt Grace. I think Mommy sent you to take care of us." The words hit Grace like a physical blow, and she sobbed openly as Emma was taken into surgery. Marcus pulled his sister into his arms, feeling the weight of her grief and love, and 25 years of separation collapse between them like a dam finally giving way. "She'll be okay," he murmured into Grace's hair, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. "She has to be okay." They spent the next 6 hours in a purgatory of antiseptic waiting rooms and vending machine coffee, taking turns pacing the corridors and checking their phones for updates that never came. Mrs. Chen arrived with a thermos of real soup and the kind of maternal comfort that transcended cultural boundaries. Pastor Murphy came with a small congregation of people from Grace's shelter, their presence a reminder that family could be chosen as well as inherited. It was Grace who noticed Victoria first, lurking near the elevators like a well-dressed specter. "Marcus, your business manager is back." Marcus looked up to see Victoria watching them through the glass partition, her usually perfect appearance disheveled, her eyes red-rimmed with what might have been tears. Something about her posture, the way she held herself like someone carrying an unbearable weight, made him pause before calling security. "Stay with Mrs. Chen," he told Grace. "I'll handle this." Victoria was staring at a memorial plaque on the wall when Marcus approached, her designer handbag clutched against her chest like armor. Up close, he could see that she'd been crying, which was so unprecedented that it stopped his anger in its tracks. "I thought you'd left," he said carefully. "I tried to." Victoria's voice was hollow, scraped raw by something Marcus couldn't identify. "I got as far as the parking garage, and then I couldn't leave. Not like this." "Like what?" Victoria turned to face him, and Marcus was shocked to see genuine anguish in her eyes. "There's something I need to tell you about your sister, about why she really lost her job." The words sent ice through Marcus's veins. "What are you talking about?" "Jonathan Hayes didn't act alone," Victoria whispered. "The embezzlement scheme, the planted evidence, the character assassination, he had help, financial backing. Someone who wanted Grace Mitchell destroyed professionally and personally." Marcus felt the floor shift beneath his feet. "Who?" Victoria's composure finally cracked completely, and she collapsed into one of the plastic chairs like a marionette with cut strings. "Me, Marcus. It was me." The confession hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his vision blur around the edges. "That's impossible. You didn't even know Grace existed." "I've known about your sister since the day you hired me," Victoria said, her voice barely audible. "I've been monitoring her for 15 years, making sure she never got close enough to your world to complicate things. When she started succeeding as a chef, when there was a chance she might become prominent enough to be noticed, to potentially reach out to you, I couldn't let that happen." Marcus sank into the chair across from her, his mind reeling with the implications. "Why? Why would you do something so monstrous?" Victoria looked up at him with eyes full of pain and guilt and something that might have been love twisted into something unrecognizable. "Because I've been in love with you for 10 years, Marcus. Because I watched what losing your wife did to you, and I couldn't bear the thought of you being hurt again. Your sister represented complications, emotional entanglements, the possibility that you might choose family over the empire we built together." The admission hung between them like poison gas, toxic and suffocating. Marcus felt a rage so pure and complete that it momentarily blinded him to everything except the desire to make Victoria suffer the way she'd made Grace suffer. "You destroyed her life," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "You took everything from her, her career, her home, her dignity. You left her homeless and broken for 18 months because you were jealous of a sister I didn't even remember." "I know," Victoria whispered. "God help me. I know what I've done." Before Marcus could respond, Dr. Goldman appeared in the hallway, still wearing surgical scrubs but with a smile that transformed her entire face. "Mr. Wellington, the surgery was a complete success." The recovery room smelled of antiseptic and hope, but Marcus barely noticed as he watched Emma sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. Her color had returned, the frightening pallor replaced by the healthy pink of childhood resilience. Grace sat beside the bed, her hand resting gently on Emma's arm, as if afraid that breaking contact might somehow undo the miracle of modern medicine and a sister's blood. Dr. Goldman had explained the surgery's success in terms that felt too clinical for the magnitude of what had happened. The blood transfusion had not only stabilized Emma's condition, but had somehow triggered her immune system to begin fighting the disorder that had been slowly destroying her from within. "Sometimes," the doctor had said with the cautious optimism of someone who'd seen too many medical miracles turn tragic, "the body just needs the right catalyst to remember how to heal itself." Marcus thought about catalysts as he watched his sister trace gentle circles on Emma's forehead, the same unconscious gesture he remembered their mother making when he'd been sick as a child. How many other memories were buried in the archaeology of his subconscious, waiting for the right trigger to surface? "She looks like you did at that age," Grace said softly, not looking away from Emma's sleeping face. "Same stubborn chin, same way of frowning even in sleep. I used to watch you nap and wonder if you'd remember me when you grew up." The words carried 25 years of wondering, and Marcus felt the weight of all those unanswered questions settling in his chest like stones. "I should have remembered you. I should have looked harder when I got older." "You were 3, Marcus." Children that age live in the present moment. It's a blessing, not a failure. Grace finally looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed but peaceful. "Besides, you did remember me. Maybe not consciously, but some part of you recognized me that night outside the restaurant. Emma felt it too. Children are more sensitive to these connections than adults." Before Marcus could respond, a soft knock interrupted their conversation. Pastor Murphy stood in the doorway, his weathered face creased with concern and something that looked like barely contained rage. "Grace, child, are you all right? I heard about the surgery, about the blood transfusion." He stepped into the room, followed by 2 people Marcus didn't recognize. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a younger man in an expensive suit who looked distinctly uncomfortable in the hospital setting. Pastor, I'm fine. Emma's going to be fine too, thanks to—" Grace paused, glancing at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Thanks to family." Pastor Murphy's eyes moved between Grace and Marcus with the sharp assessment of someone who'd spent decades reading the complicated dynamics of broken families. "Mr. Wellington, I presume? Grace has told me a great deal about you over the years." The words carried weight that made Marcus uncomfortable. How much did this stranger know about his family's failures? How many nights had Grace spent in a homeless shelter, telling stories about the brother who'd forgotten she existed? "Pastor Murphy has been investigating what happened to me," Grace said carefully. "The false accusations, the evidence that destroyed my career. He didn't believe I was guilty." The middle-aged woman stepped forward, extending her hand to Marcus. "Detective Angela Martinez, Financial Crimes Division. I've been working with Pastor Murphy to reopen Grace's case. What we've discovered is significant." Marcus felt his blood pressure spike. After Victoria's confession in the waiting room, he wasn't sure he could handle any more revelations about the systematic destruction of his sister's life. "What kind of significant?" Detective Martinez exchanged glances with the man in the suit. "Mr. Wellington, this is Assistant District Attorney David Chen. We need to discuss the evidence we've gathered against Victoria Sterling and Jonathan Hayes. The scope of the conspiracy against your sister is far worse than we initially suspected." The words hit Marcus like ice water. He'd left Victoria in the waiting room after her tearful confession, too focused on Emma's surgery to deal with the implications of what she'd revealed. Now, seeing the grim expressions on the faces of these law enforcement officials, he realized that Victoria's admission had been only the tip of a much darker iceberg. ADA Chen opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "Mrs. Sterling's financial records show payments totaling over $200,000 to various individuals over the past 2 years, payments that coincide exactly with key events in the destruction of your sister's reputation." "She bribed the witnesses," Grace said quietly. "The vendors who testified that I'd been embezzling from them, the restaurant staff who claimed they'd seen me doctoring receipts. Victoria paid them all." Detective Martinez nodded grimly. "But it goes deeper than that. We've also found evidence that Ms. Sterling hired private investigators to monitor your sister's activities going back 15 years. She's been tracking Grace's movements, her employment, her relationships, essentially orchestrating a surveillance operation that would make the FBI proud." Marcus felt sick. The woman who'd helped him build his empire, who'd been his trusted advisor and confidant, had been conducting a covert war against his own sister for more than a decade. How did she even know Grace existed? Ada Chen pulled out a document that made Marcus's hands shake when he saw it. Adoption records from 1998. Sealed records that should have been impossible for a private citizen to access. Ms. Sterling used her connections with certain law firms to obtain copies when you first hired her as your business manager. The timeline made Marcus's stomach turn. Victoria had known about Grace from the very beginning of their professional relationship. Every piece of advice she'd given him, every strategic decision they'd made together, had been filtered through her knowledge of a secret he hadn't even remembered he was keeping. "She's been systematically destroying anyone who might have connected you to your sister," Detective Martinez continued. "The private investigator Grace hired in 2015, his license was mysteriously revoked after Victoria filed complaints about his methods. The social worker who handled your adoption case, she retired early after receiving anonymous harassment that made her life unbearable." Grace's face had gone pale as paper. "Mrs. Henderson. She was the social worker who used to visit me at the Mitchell house. She tried to help me when I aged out of foster care, but then she just disappeared. I always wondered what happened to her." "Victoria Sterling happened to her," Ada Chen said grimly, "along with at least 6 other people whose only crime was existing in the orbit of Grace's search for her biological family." The scope of Victoria's obsession was breathtaking in its cruelty and thoroughness. Marcus thought about all the times she'd warned him about gold diggers and people who might try to take advantage of his success. She'd been planting seeds of paranoia about exactly the scenario that had finally come to pass. His homeless sister entering his life and disrupting the carefully controlled world Victoria had helped him build. "Where is Mrs. Sterling now?" Marcus asked, dreading the answer. Detective Martinez and ADA Chen exchanged another loaded look. "That's what we need to discuss with you, Mr. Wellington. She's downstairs in the hospital parking garage, and she's asking to speak with you. She claims she has information that could help us recover money and assets that were stolen from your sister, but she'll only talk to you." Marcus felt Grace's hand slip into his, her fingers cold but steady. "You don't have to see her," she said quietly. "Whatever she has to say, whatever she's offering, I don't need it. I have my family back. That's worth more than any amount of money." But Marcus was already standing, fury and responsibility warring in his chest. Victoria had spent 15 years of her life orchestrating his sister's destruction, and now she wanted to negotiate. "I'll talk to her," he said, his voice hard as winter stone. "But not alone. Grace comes with me." "Marcus, no." "She's dangerous." "She's finished," Marcus cut off Detective Martinez's protest. "Her entire world is collapsing, and she knows it. But Grace deserves to look her in the eye when she apologizes. She deserves to see justice done." Ada Chen nodded slowly. "We'll be monitoring the conversation, and we'll have officers positioned throughout the area. Miss Sterling isn't officially under arrest yet, but she's not going anywhere." As they prepared to leave Emma's room, Pastor Murphy caught Grace's arm gently. "Child, are you sure about this? Some devils are better left unconfronted." Grace looked back at Emma, sleeping peacefully under the warm blanket of family love and medical success. "Pastor, I spent 18 months believing I deserved what happened to me. I thought God was punishing me for some sin I couldn't name. Now I know it wasn't divine justice, it was human evil. I need to see it end." The elevator ride to the parking garage felt like descending into the underworld. Marcus kept glancing at Grace, searching for signs that this confrontation might break something in her that had finally begun to heal. But his sister's face was serene, almost peaceful, as if she'd found strength in finally knowing the truth about her persecution. Victoria was waiting beside a black sedan, her usually perfect appearance disheveled, and her designer suit wrinkled from hours of pacing. When she saw Marcus and Grace approaching with their police escort, something crumpled in her posture. Not defeat, exactly, but the recognition that the game she'd been playing for 15 years was finally over. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "Both of you. I know I have no right to ask for your time, but there are things you need to know. Things that might help you understand why I—" She trailed off, seeming to realize that no explanation could justify what she'd done. Grace stepped forward, and Marcus was amazed by the dignity in his sister's posture. After everything Victoria had taken from her, Grace faced her tormentor with the grace of someone who'd found peace in the midst of justice. "I don't need to understand you," Grace said quietly. "I need you to understand that you failed. You tried to keep me away from my family, but here we are. You tried to destroy my spirit, but I'm still standing. You tried to convince me I was worthless. But my blood saved a little girl's life today." Victoria's face crumpled completely, and she sobbed with the kind of desperate grief that comes from realizing you've wasted your life on the wrong dreams. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "God help me, Grace. I'm so sorry. I thought if I could just control enough variables, I could make everything perfect." I could protect him from being hurt the way his father was hurt. My father wasn't hurt by love, Marcus said, his voice cutting through Victoria's excuses like a blade. He was hurt by betrayal, just like you've hurt me, just like you've hurt Grace. You became the very thing you claimed to be protecting me from. Detective Martinez stepped forward with handcuffs, but Victoria held up a trembling hand. Please, the briefcase in my car. Account numbers, passwords, documentation of every transaction. I kept records of everything. Grace's settlement from the restaurant, her legal fees, the money she lost in destroyed opportunities. I can help you recover it all. As Victoria was led away in handcuffs, Grace turned to Marcus with tears streaming down her face. But when she spoke, her voice was steady and sure. It's over, she said simply. Whatever happens next with the legal proceedings, whatever money gets recovered or justice gets served, the important part is over. We found each other, Marcus. We saved Emma. We're a family again. Marcus pulled his sister into his arms, feeling the weight of 15 years of manipulation and lies lifting from his shoulders. Victoria's confession had revealed the true scope of the conspiracy against Grace. But it had also revealed something more important, the unbreakable bond between siblings who'd found their way back to each other despite every effort to keep them apart. Christmas morning arrived 1 year later with the kind of pristine snowfall that transforms New York City into something resembling a fairy tale. The Wellington penthouse had been transformed beyond recognition, not by expensive decorators, but by the accumulated warmth of a family that had learned to build traditions from scratch. The sterile marble surfaces were now covered with Emma's artwork, Grace's handwritten recipe cards, and photographs that told the story of their unconventional journey back to each other. Marcus stood at the kitchen window watching Grace teach Emma how to knead bread for their Christmas breakfast. His daughter, now 8 years old and glowing with health, had inherited her aunt's gift for cooking, along with her stubborn determination to perfect every technique. Grace's patient guidance reminded him of watching his own mother in their childhood kitchen, though those memories felt like glimpses of someone else's life now. The dough should feel like a baby's skin, Grace was saying, guiding Emma's small hands, smooth and soft and just a little bit warm. Emma giggled at the comparison, flour dusting her nose in Christmas pajamas. How do you know what baby skin feels like? You don't have any babies. Grace's hand stilled for just a moment, and Marcus caught the shadow that crossed her face. The same expression she got whenever the conversation turned to things she'd never had, dreams deferred by circumstances beyond her control. At 29, Grace had spent so many years focused on survival that she'd never allowed herself to imagine a future that included love, marriage, or children of her own. I know because I once had a little brother who felt just like that, Grace said softly, meeting Marcus's eyes over Emma's head. And now, I have a niece whose hugs are even better than baby skin. The legal proceedings had concluded 6 months ago with Victoria Sterling sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. Jonathan Hayes had received a similar sentence after agreeing to testify against Victoria in exchange for a reduced term. Grace's name had been officially cleared, her criminal record expunged, and the settlement money Victoria had helped steal was returned with interest that brought the total to nearly $500,000. But the money, while practically helpful, felt insignificant compared to the restoration of Grace's reputation in the culinary world. Food Wine magazine had run a cover story titled "The Chef Who Came Back from Hell," detailing not just her wrongful persecution, but her remarkable talent that had never dimmed despite years of enforced exile from professional kitchens. Job offers poured in from restaurants across the country. Television producers wanted to create shows around her story, and publishers competed to sign her for a cookbook deal. Grace had turned them all down. Instead, she'd used her settlement money to open something unprecedented in Manhattan, a combination restaurant and culinary school that served both paying customers and homeless individuals, where people could learn job skills while being fed with dignity and respect. The Wellington Foundation, as Marcus had insisted on calling it despite Grace's protests, operated out of a renovated warehouse in Queens and employed dozens of formerly homeless individuals who'd graduated from Grace's training programs. "Daddy, come help us with the cinnamon rolls," Emma called, breaking Marcus from his reverie. "Aunt Grace says you're the only one tall enough to reach the good vanilla." Marcus joined them at the counter, marveling at how natural this felt. The three of them working together in comfortable synchronization, hands occasionally brushing as they shared space and tasks. Grace had moved into the penthouse permanently after Emma's surgery, taking the guest room that had quickly filled with her grandmother's rescued cookbooks, plants that thrived under her care, and the kind of lived-in warmth that no decorator could manufacture. Mrs. Chen arrived at noon with an army of containers filled with traditional Chinese Christmas foods, her face beaming as Emma ran to greet her with flower-covered hugs. The elderly woman had become more than a neighbor. She was the grandmother Emma had never had, the mother figure Grace had lost too young, and the wise counselor Marcus had never known he needed. "How are my favorite people today, Mrs. Chen asked, setting her containers on the counter and immediately beginning to fuss over Emma's appearance. "Emma, darling, you have more flour in your hair than in the bread." "We're making cinnamon rolls from Great-Grandma Rose's recipe," Emma announced proudly. "Aunt Grace says food is how we tell people we love them." "Your aunt is very wise," Mrs. Chen agreed, but her eyes were on Grace with the sharp assessment of someone who'd learned to read the subtle signs of inner turmoil. "Grace, child, you look tired. Are you sleeping enough?" Grace's smile was practiced and automatic, the kind of reassurance she'd perfected during her months on the streets when admitting weakness could mean the difference between shelter and danger. But Mrs. Chen had known too many displaced people to be fooled by surface pleasantries. "I'm fine, Mrs. Chen, just busy with the restaurant and the new training program starting next month." Mrs. Chen's tone suggested she wasn't convinced, but she let the subject drop in favor of directing Emma in the proper technique for folding wontons. Pastor Murphy arrived in the afternoon, bringing with him 3 of Grace's former shelter residents, who'd become family by choice rather than blood. Maria Santos, now head chef at a downtown bistro after completing Grace's program. Kevin Williams, who'd used his settlement from Victoria's Victims' Compensation Fund to open a small catering business, and Janet Foster, whose struggles with addiction had been compounded by homelessness until Grace's intervention gave her the structure and purpose she needed to rebuild her life. The dinner table conversation flowed with the easy warmth of people who'd survived difficult circumstances and emerged grateful for second chances. Kevin regaled them with stories of catering disasters that had somehow turned into triumphs, while Janet shared updates from her work with other addicts seeking recovery. Maria had brought photographs from her recent wedding, a small ceremony where Grace had served as maid of honor and Marcus had walked her down the aisle in place of the father who'd disowned her years earlier. "I keep thinking about this time last year," Maria said, raising her glass of sparkling cider in toast. "Grace was serving Christmas dinner at the shelter, and I was convinced my life was over. Now look at us. Kevin's got 3 catering contracts lined up for New Year's Eve. Janet's 6 months clean, and I'm married to the most wonderful man in the world. And Grace has her family back," Pastor Murphy added, his weathered face soft with affection as he looked around the table. "Sometimes I think God works in the strangest ways, bringing people exactly what they need, disguised as the thing they think they can't survive." Emma, who'd been listening with the serious attention she brought to all adult conversations, suddenly brightened with an idea that made her bounce in her chair. "Aunt Grace, since you found us and we're family now, does that mean you'll stay forever? Even when I grow up and get married and have my own babies?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, innocent in the way only children's questions could be, but loaded with the weight of all their collective fears about abandonment and impermanence. Grace's eyes filled with tears, and Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion he hadn't expected. "Oh, sweetheart," Grace whispered, reaching across the table to take Emma's hands. "I will love you forever, no matter what. Family doesn't stop being family just because people grow up or circumstances change. You're stuck with me for life. Promise?" Emma's voice was small, vulnerable in a way that reminded Marcus of all the losses she'd already experienced in her short life. "Promise," Grace said solemnly, then looked at Marcus with an expression that encompassed gratitude, love, and something deeper that he was only beginning to understand. "I promise both of you." As the evening wound down and their guests began to leave, Marcus found himself alone with Grace in the kitchen while Emma showed Mrs. Chen her new art supplies upstairs. The comfortable silence between them had become one of his favorite parts of their shared life. The ease of two people who no longer needed to fill every moment with conversation. "Thank you," Grace said suddenly, her hands stilling in the soapy dishwater. "For what?" "For letting me stay, for sharing Emma with me, for giving me a chance to be part of a family again." She turned to face him, and Marcus was struck by how much she'd changed in the year since he'd found her beside that dumpster. The haunted look had faded from her eyes, replaced by something that looked like peace. "I know this wasn't what you planned when you invited a homeless woman to dinner on Christmas Eve." Marcus dried his hands on a dish towel, considering his words carefully. "Grace, nothing about my life has gone according to plan. Sarah wasn't supposed to die. Emma wasn't supposed to get sick. I wasn't supposed to spend the first 35 years of my life not knowing I had a sister who needed me." He moved closer, noting how Grace's breath caught slightly at his proximity. Over the months, something had shifted between them. Not romantic exactly, because that would have been complicated by their relationship, but something deeper and more essential than simple familial affection. "But maybe that's the point," he continued. "Maybe the best things in life are the ones we never could have planned for. Emma is healthier and happier than she's been since Sarah died. I've remembered what it feels like to have a family instead of just a household. And you?" He paused, studying her face in the warm light of the kitchen. "You've become the heart of this home in ways I didn't even know we needed." Grace's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I love you both so much it sometimes scares me. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something to happen that proves I don't deserve this happiness." "Victoria thought she was protecting me by keeping us apart," Marcus said softly. "But what she never understood is that family isn't a weakness to be protected from. It's a strength to be cherished. You and Emma are my strength, Grace. You're the reason I remember how to be human instead of just successful." As midnight approached and Emma finally fell asleep, clutching her new teddy bear, Marcus and Grace stood together at the living room window, watching snow fall over the city that had both wounded them and brought them back together. The view from the penthouse encompassed millions of stories, people struggling and surviving, loving and losing, searching for connection in a world that often felt designed to keep people apart. "Next year," Grace said quietly, "I want to expand the program. Open a second location. Maybe start a scholarship fund for kids aging out of foster care who want to learn culinary skills." Marcus smiled, recognizing the tone in her voice, the same determined optimism that had carried her through months of homelessness and years of searching for a family that had forgotten she existed. "Next year," he agreed, "we'll build something even better. Together." Dear friends, as we reach the end of Marcus and Grace's journey, I want you to think about the families in your own life, not just the ones connected by blood, but the ones connected by choice, understanding, and unconditional love. How many of us have spent years believing we were alone when somewhere out there someone was searching for us too? Marcus thought success meant having everything under control, but real wealth came when he opened his heart to the homeless woman. His daughter's compassion led them to help. Grace thought she was unworthy of love after losing everything, but discovered that sometimes our greatest losses prepare us for our most meaningful connections. At 55, 60, or 65, it's never too late to find your people. The ones who see your worth when the world has written you off, who love you not for what you can provide, but for who you are. Emma's innocent question, "Can she have dinner with us?" changed 3 lives forever because a child understood what adults often forget. Love multiplies when it's shared. This Christmas season, remember that the greatest gifts often come disguised as interruptions to our carefully planned lives. Have you ever had someone unexpected enter your life who became family? What act of kindness changed your perspective on what family really means? Share your stories below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.